Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everybody doing well. Welcome back to our Friday evening halaqas. Tonight we will be continuing from where we left off about 2 weeks ago. So last Friday we did not have a Friday evening halaqa. So today we will continue from where we left off previously. So we spoke about the Battle of the Bridge, right? That was one of the major battles that we were talking about. And we said that this battle, basically, the Muslims probably took the greatest defeat, you can say, when it comes to facing the Persians. So the Muslims at this time, on the front that we're talking about, the Muslim army was facing the Persians. They were facing Iran, Iraq, mainly the Sassanid Empire. And while they were facing the Sassanid Empire, there were many battles that took place, but this Battle of the Bridge, it's something actually you can Google, and there's a lot written on the Battle of the Bridge, but this is one of the major blows against the Muslims, and probably the most significant loss when it came to fighting the Persians, and at the same time, the most significant and probably the most beneficial win that the Persians had against the Muslims. So overall, when the Muslims were facing the Persians, the Persians did not have that many victories, and they didn't have many successful victories against the Muslim armies, except for this one Battle of the Bridge, which was their major victory against the Muslims. We spoke about Muthanna, who was the commander al-Muthanna. He sent a request to Umar radiallahu an to prepare or to send more reinforcements, and this was after the queen was dethroned. So we went, if you remember, I showed some of the coins from the queen's time, and then from her, from the person that replaced the queen. I believe his name is Yazgard. Let me check. Yeah, either Yazgard or Yazdigard. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he was the king, and he was actually the last of the Sasanian kings, because after that, the Muslim army eventually defeats his army and dethrones him, and that's the end of the Sassanid Empire. So Yazdigard the third, he's known as, is the last of the Sasanian kings. But during this time, he actually replaces the queen that's there. And what he does is he starts making some changes. There was, before this moment, as we mentioned last time, there were civil battles that the Persians were facing at this time. Eventually, they united, they overthrew the queen or replaced the queen. And we mentioned the last important individual that we mentioned was Rustam. And Rustam was the Persian general. So in terms of the Persian side, we have Yazdigard III, who's the king, who's the last Sasanian king, the last Persian king. We have Rustam, who's his main general. And Rustam has, he's to another level as well. He controls the Persian forces. He's the most important warrior, you can say, when it comes to the battles between Muslims and the Persians here. So we have these individuals that we spoke about last time, and then we said Al-Muthanna, who was the commander of the Muslims. He sent this request to Umar radiallahu an, asking for reinforcements to fight against the Persians. Now, again, this is on the Persian front. Remember, previously we also spoke about what was going on in terms of Sham, in terms of Syria. And I think we left that off at Khalid ibn Walid surrounding the city of Damascus, right? The Muslims took the various cities around Damascus. Then they eventually surrounded Damascus while Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was still alive. But the siege outlasted the life of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. And eventually the Muslims took Damascus after the passing of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh and during the lifetime of Umar radiallahu anh. But we will come back to that front later. Right now we're focusing on the relationship between the Muslim armies and the Persian armies. So here Umar radiallahu anh now issues new orders, and he calls out for reinforcements to the southern tribes. The northern tribes, he actually tells them to start marching right away. The southern tribes, he would assemble them in Medina, and then he would send them out. And it's mentioned that he calls out for this extensive sort of reinforcements, that whoever is available, wherever we can get soldiers from, let's send them all up. And eventually, Umar, as he's doing this, it's mentioned he goes, he performs Hajj, he comes back from Hajj, and he prepares this camp outside of the city of Medina. He's intending to lead the army himself. So that the intent is that this army will gather, and Umar radiallahu anh will take this army and march to Persia, right? March to, and again, Persia is Iraq and Iran at that time, and different areas as well, but that's the area that we're looking at. We're not specifically looking at the modern country of Iran. So Umar radiallahu anh, he's preparing these soldiers, or these troops that he's preparing. He leaves Ali radiallahu anh in charge of Medina while he's gone. So he places Ali radiallahu anh in charge of Medina in his absence. And the person that will take care of the city, because Medina, remember, is the capital for the Muslims at the time. And Medina remains the capital during the four Khalifas until in the life of Ali, he moves the capital. So we're going to discuss that later when it comes. But during the Khulafa Rashidin, for the most part, the capital of the Muslims was the city of Medina. And then after Ali radiallahu anh moves the capital, Medina becomes more of a religious city than the political capital of the Muslims at that point. So here they gather kind of a war council, right? So they have some of the senior companions, and Umar radiallahu anh is consulting these companions. Included in these companions is Uthman radiallahu anh, and many of the companions that were there at Badr. And Umar is discussing these plans with them, that what should be done. How should we go about facing the Sassanian army? Now, all or majority of the council suggests that Umar should not lead the battle. So one of the traditions that was found previously was that the king or the general or the leader would, generally speaking, go into battle. And this was even done after the time of Umar radiallahu anh. When you look at the different khulafa of the Umayyad or Abbasid or Ottomans, especially the Ottomans, many of them would actually go into battle themselves. So the conquest of Istanbul or any of the later events that take place as well, you'll see many of the leaders at the time, they would be the ones leading the charge, meaning leading the actual armies that would go, and then they would return to the capital. And sometimes you would have that not happening. You would have the Khalifa being in charge and sending out the generals or whatever it may be, depending on what they're facing. So this was something that was mutually discussed between the council that they would have. Here in Umar radiallahu anhu's time, the companions gather in this council and they discuss whether Umar should lead the charge or not. Most of them in favor of Umar not leading the charge. And they said that if the Muslims face a loss, it would be chaos. If Umar radiallahu anh is there and he's killed in battle or something like this happens, it would be complete chaos. So it would be better that Umar radiallahu anh stay in Medina and he send the army and just be in contact with the army. So Umar radiallahu anh eventually agrees to that, and he stays in the city of Medina. Now the person that they place in charge of this army that they're sending is a companion by the name of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. And Sa'ad is he's actually one of the earlier companions of the Prophet ﷺ. He's one of the Ashara Mubashara, one of the 10 companions that were given the glad tidings of Jannah in their lifetimes. So he's placed in charge. And Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas is actually a close companion of the Prophet ﷺ. So this army, eventually, what they gathered was about, let me see. So, okay, so it says over 30,000. There's different, slight narrations, but it grew a lot over 30,000 beyond that, because even when the first or initial armies were dispatched, as people came and as people joined, they would send them over as well. But we're looking at approximately 30,000 soldiers. Now, in these 30,000 soldiers, you have 300 companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now look at the number differences, right? You have 300 companions in comparison to 30,000 soldiers. And then you also have, I think, about 70, let me just make sure. Yes, 70 companions that were part of the Battle of Badr. So 70 companions from the Battle of Badr. Remember when we did the Sira sessions, we said in the Battle of Badr there was about 300. Some narrations say 313, some say 317, 311. These are all different numbers that are out there, but approximately 300 and something. Right, that was the number at the Battle of Badr on the Muslim side versus approximately 1,000 on the Qurayshi side in the Battle of Badr during the lifetime of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After the hijrah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first battle that takes place. Now, 70 of those companions that were present at the Battle of Badr, they're also taking place in this battle, right? In this battle that Umar is dispatching this army with Sa'ad radiallahu an. 70 companions from the Battle of Badr are present as part of this army. And about 300 companions in total, and about 30,000 soldiers from the Muslim side are present for this battle. Now, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, like we said, was a companion that was a close companion of the Prophet ﷺ. It's mentioned that he became Muslim when he was only 17, so he was young when he became Muslim, and he was there for the battles with the Prophet ﷺ. So as Sa'ad is arriving in Iraq, right? So he's missioned, or his mission is to get to Iraq. Muthanna, remember the one that requested Umar radiallahu anh to send these reinforcements, he is becoming bedridden, right? He's very close to passing away. And it's mentioned that some of the wounds that he received during the Battle of the Bridge, the one that we spoke about last time, some of them remained, and they actually eventually caused his passing. But it's not, there's different narrations on whether he passed away at the precise moment when Sa'ad is arriving in Iraq, or whether he arrived but they didn't get to meet. Those are very minor differences. But basically, as Sa'ad was arriving in Iraq, right, stationed at this, Al-Muthanna was passing away. And he passes away, and he leaves certain instructions and certain he leaves almost an advice for Sa'ad, saying that fight the enemies at the edge of the borders, of the Muslim borders. And he says this because the desert will be behind them, and the Persians, if they win, right, it will be victory for the Muslims. They can go forward. If they lose, they can go back into the desert, and the Persians will not go into the desert. They will not chase them into the desert. So this is, some of the instructions and some of the wisdom that he leaves behind, because Al-Muthanna is the Muslim general, and he's one of the lesser talked about generals, you can say, even though he's vital to the early conquests of the Muslims, right? So just important as Khalid ibn Walid, right? Khalid ibn Walid, everybody knows his name. Everybody talks about the different battles of Khalid ibn Walid, especially during the time of the early Muslim conquest, during Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's time, Umar radiallahu anhu's time. But just, or I wouldn't say exactly as important, but up there, right, with a similar level of importance is Al-Muthanna, who also, fought many battles and made it possible for the Muslim army to get to where they are right now with the Persians. So Al-Muthanna, he passes away during this time, and now he leaves his troops, whatever troops that he had, under the command of his brother, eventually then to Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. And his brother is the one that goes and eventually informs Sa'ad that Al-Muthanna passed away, and his message was for the Muslim army to hold their ground at the borders of the desert and fight the enemy there again, so that if they needed to flee, they can flee, and the army will not chase them into the desert. All right, so now this battle that's going to take place is known as the Qadisiyya battle, right? This is a very famous battle in Islamic history during the time of Umar radiallahu anh, the battle of Qadisiyya. And what happens is Sa'ad, he places his troops approximately 45 kilometers outside of the city of Kufa, and that's where this area is, Qadisiyya. So they kind of settle their army there, and they're waiting for instructions from Umar radiallahu anh. Now it's mentioned that this entire campaign, as it's taking place, Sa'ad is directly in touch with Umar. They're almost writing to each other on a daily basis. They're making sure that it's getting back and forth. Obviously, it's not how we have communications today, that you could just send a message and it's there. It takes time, but they're in constant contact with each other. Um, and that's slightly different from many of the other campaigns, where a lot of the generals that are placed in charge, like Khalid ibn Walid, like these generals that are their points, they have to make the decision right there and then, right? They can't really, a lot of these times, they can't wait for the command to come from Medina and reach them, when it'll take weeks before they can make a quick decision, right? So many of the decisions have to be made directly by the generals, and a lot of times the Khalifa or whoever's in charge gives them instructions, and they tend to abide by these instructions and try their best to interpret these instructions for whatever new issues that come up. So here at Qadisiyah, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas is actually in contact with Umar radiallahu anh as often as he can be, and he's trying to hear from Umar. So Umar eventually tells him to camp at this place, Al Qadisiyah, and it's about 45 kilometers outside of Kufa. Now, during this time, Umar radiallahu anh tells Sa'ad to send a delegation to the actual king. So they send a delegation to the capital of the Persian Empire, and it's mentioned that it's about just over a dozen people that are part of this delegation. Some of them can actually speak the language. Some of them were serving as a translator or whatnot. So they eventually go to Yazdegerd, right, or Yazdegerd, and the precise story, again, a lot of these are historical narrations. So the precise story of what took place in the court of Yazdegerd when the delegation showed up, what exactly took place, these are all just different narrations that are there. So some mention that he asked them that why are they planning to fight them, or why are they interested in fighting this, and there was an exchange of words between them, right? So the Muslim said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a messenger and he commanded us to do good. He forbade us from doing evil. He promised us good in this world and the hereafter if we obey the commands of Allah. They invited him to embrace Islam. If not, they invited him and his kingdom to pay jizya to the Muslim army, or the protection tax. And they had this back and forth going between them. And it's mentioned that the emperor, he was kind of he was confused, because the size of his army versus the size of the Muslim army, that who are you to make demands, right? So you're coming here with this army of 30,000, right? A very small army. Who are you to make demands such great? And you'll see that the army that actually faces the Muslims at this war is about 120,000 soldiers, right? Because this is not, you're not looking at a small city, you're not looking at a city-state. This is the Persian Empire. Although towards the end of the Persian Empire, this is, not in its peak or anything of that sort, it's still one of the greatest empires that was there at the time, right? The Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire were the two most powerful empires on earth during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anh. During the entire Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anh, it wasn't that the Muslim empire, the Khilafah al-Rashidiyya, was the strongest empire on earth. It wasn't, right? So they're facing against, or they're going against this massive empire, and they have this small amount of soldiers, and they're demanding that they either pay jizya, they submit to the Muslims, they put down their arms, right? So all of these are seen as empty threats for the most part, but they already know that the Muslims mean business to a certain extent. Remember, they overthrew their queen because the people who controlled the country, the people who controlled the empire, those that were directly underneath the queen, they felt that it was because of a weak queen that they were losing power to this desert group, as they saw them. And they actually, some of the responses mentioned that during this court session of Yazdegerd, he actually says that you are hungry adventurers that come from a barren land. Like, do you expect us to give in to you, right? And he says, I will give you some, something to make you content and go away, kind of in a dismissive way. Eventually, some narrations mention that he said, if it wasn't against the law, that I would have all of you executed, right? Because remember, they're a delegation there. It's part of the international understanding at that time that you don't kill messengers, right? You don't kill delegations when it comes to messengers. Um, it's just a well-known understanding between all of these different empires. So here, what happens is he eventually sends them back, and he does not negotiate. He doesn't want to do anything. Eventually, that's the emperor. Remember the military leader of the Persians, Rustum also invites them, right? Rustum also invites them, or Rustam. Um, he also invites them as well into kind of like the court of Rustam. So it's mentioned that he had these carpets laid out, and this is similar descriptions that's mentioned when the delegation went to the emperor as well, that it was all of these worldly luxuries that were present. And many of these worldly luxuries you'll see later on. It's not actually part of our halaqat, but these were present in the later Khilafas of the Muslims, right? So when the Muslim empire, when it entered into the Umayyad phase, or the Abbasid phase, or the Ottoman phase, right? Many similar empire settings that is present, that the Muslims are entering upon, and they're seeing that, look, these Persian kings are dressed with these fancy, robes, and the carpets that are laid down, all of this worldly luxury that's present, exactly how it is there, you'll see it later on in Muslim history, right? And we probably know the many stories of when the Mongols came and they eventually wrapped the Khalifa in the rug of the Khalifa. He had all of these fancy rugs, and it's mentioned that the Khalifa of the Abbasids at the time, he buried the treasure, right? And it's all of these stories that you hear later on of the Muslims, different leaders of the Muslims hoarding the wealth and not distributing it appropriately, and all of this corruption that creeps in later on. Not to say that every single leader was corrupt after the Khulafa al-Rashidin, but many of these similar stories are present as well in the Muslim empires to come. But during this time, during the Khilafah al-Rashidiyya, right, this is why the Khulafa al-Rashidin are held to that extent, right? Are held to that level of reverence, that they were truly humble to their word. They did not live as kings. Umar radiallahu anh did not rule as a king. He did not rule, from a throne. He did not sit on a throne. And that was just not their way. And as we discussed before as well, some of the ethical aspects of the rule of Umar radiallahu anh that he implemented, right? When he wrote to his governors that, if I see you indulging in worldly luxuries, right, then I have the right to punish you. So if you're going to accept this governorship from me, then I have the right to remove you if you engage in any of that. That was the rule set by the Khulafa al-Rashidin, or by Umar radiallahu anhu in specific. So when the Muslims enter the court of the Persian emperor, right, and they see all of this luxury, right, it's new to them in terms of the leader ruling in this way. Then similar things take place when they enter the court of the general, right, Rustam. When they enter his court, or Rustam, when they enter his court, they see a similar extravagance that's being displayed, where the carpets are rolled out, where he's sitting on this throne. There's all of these jewels. Again, Persia has a lot of wealth. Persia is still a very powerful empire compared to the Muslim army and the city of Medina and the Muslim empire at the time, the Rashidun state. And that's why when you look into historical discussions on this, right, historical books that are written in this time period, there's a level of amazement how fast the Muslim empire grew, right? Obviously, as Muslims, we believe that when the Muslims were sincere in their work, this was victory through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But people who don't believe in the victory through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're just surprised, right? They're trying to decipher why there's an extreme and super fast success on behalf of the Muslims during this time, that they start from nothing, right? They barely have horses for all of their soldiers, and they take on the two greatest empires of the world at the time. The Sassanid Empire, it ends at the hands of the Muslims. The Byzantine Empire ends at the hands of the Muslims, right? So both of these massive empires, the two world powers, both end at the hands of the Muslim armies that were sent out during these times. So here they enter into the court of Rustam, the general, and a similar conversation takes place. Now, the narrations that come in terms of Rustam slightly differ. Some mention that he tries to convince some of his advisors and some of his the generals under him to consider negotiating. Eventually, he asks the Muslims that, how much time do we have to decide whether we're going to fight or we can negotiate this jizya kind of contract. And the delegation, or the head of the delegation, Rabi', he says that 3 days. So you have 3 days, and in these you can decide what you want to do. And if you if you lay down your arms and you pay the jizya, you'll be protected. Nobody will be harmed. So eventually, Rustum is not able to convince his army. Again, these are narrations, whether he actually went and convinced his, or tried to convince his army or whatnot. I emphasize this because when you read, even in the Islamic sources, when you read the different books on the Khulafa al-Rashidin and what details took place, they differ themselves, right? So the 2-3 books that we're using, for example, we're using Imam Suyuti's book, we're using I forget his name, Imam Bajuri's book. We're using multiple books on the Khulafa al-Rashidin and what took place, and some of them would mention certain narrations, some of them won't. These narrations are not, the exact details of them are not checked to the level of hadith, because they don't have implications in your religion. Right? These are narrations, historical narrations, and they're narrated like any other historical narration that's narrated. Right? We don't scrutinize it like we do to hadith to make sure that it's sahih to a certain level. Obviously, sometimes narrations we find out they're fabricated, then we no longer use them, even as pieces of history, if we can confirm that they're fabricated. So here, he's given 3 days, and in these 3 days, it's mentioned that the Muslims, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas is preparing the Muslims for battle. It's mentioned that on the day of the battle, right, he instructs the Quran reciters to recite Surah Al-Anfal. It's one of the surahs of the Quran, and this is to kind of calm down the armies. And the Muslims, they offer Dhuhr prayer, and their armies begin to advance. Now, when the armies come out, right, when Rustum comes out with his army, they have about 120,000 soldiers. It's mentioned that during this battle of Qadisiyah, that the commander, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, was not actually able to lead the army, right? That he was sick, he was suffering from some of these illnesses, so he was actually in bed rest, and he was watching from above the battlefields. So he wasn't actually on the battlefield itself. And the Persians again came out with elephants. Now the elephants are a sort of terror for the Muslim armies at the time, especially for the Arabs. If you remember some of the other battles that took place as well, we mentioned that elephants were brought out. And then going back to the birth year of the Prophet ﷺ, named after the significant event as the year of the elephant, Am al-Fil, because of this event that took place where Abraha came with elephants to the city of Mecca to destroy the Kaaba, so then he can build something similar in Yemen and that people can do pilgrimage there. But the idea was these elephants were seen as these massive creatures that they're not used to. So eventually the Muslims found a way around it, that they figured out if they can disrupt the elephants that are leading this army of elephants, it's mentioned 30, 40 elephants, that it would cause chaos to all of the elephants and the riders. So some of the Muslims actually went in straight for the elephants, and they started to attack, removing the fear of that elephant from their hearts, and this just went in, and it caused chaos between the different elephants that were present. Now, during this battle, the great Persian general Rustum was also killed. Different narrations have it that he was hiding under a mule, and somebody killed the mule. It fell on him, crushed his back. He started crawling to the river. Some people found him, and they eventually killed him. So he actually fell during this battle of Qadisiyah. And again, he's one of the last great generals of the Persian Empire, Rustum. And pretty much after the commander is killed, right, it became chaos for the Persian side, and they started swinging here and there and started fleeing the battlefield, and the Muslims gained the victory at this time, although they had a large amount of loss from their armies. If you remember, it's about 30,000 or slightly over 30,000 soldiers. Out of that, about 8,500 soldiers were killed on the Muslim side, right? So they were martyred on the Muslim side, 8,500 during this battle of Qadisiyah. And on the Persian side, they lost approximately, let me get the number up here. Um, it's mentioned that 30,000. So Persians, about 30,000 were killed. Um, and this was, again, year 36. So before I actually talk about the good news reaching Umar, um, I just want us to see where we are. I'm going to share the same chart that we looked at before. So 636 is here, 1500. So this is where this battle of Qadisiyah is taking place. The last great general of, hopefully everybody can see my screen, of the Persians is killed during this battle. So he falls in battle. And now this army, this great Persian army, starts to flee. Now the Persians are not done with, right? As you'll see over here, right? There's going to be an event where they pray in the halls of Khusro. So here, I'm going to get rid of this map. Again, we'll keep bringing up this map just for us to understand where we are in this timeline of Umar radiallahu anh. Now, the news of victory starts heading out to Medina. So the Muslims won. The messenger is sent to Medina, and it's mentioned that Umar radiallahu anh would make his daily rounds where he would go to the outskirts of Medina, wait to see if there's anybody bringing news. And he saw this messenger rushing in towards Medina. And he asks this messenger, and this messenger doesn't actually recognize that it's Umar radiallahu anh. He asks this messenger, as the messenger is continuously running inside, what happened? Is there any news? What's going on? What did you hear? And this rider is speaking to him like, think of it this way, right? He's rushing in to go and give this great news to the Khalifa. So he's riding in to the city of Medina. And Umar radiallahu anh sees him and he starts questioning him. He doesn't recognize it's Umar. So Umar is running behind him. And as Umar is running behind this messenger, the messenger is responding to his question. So he's not being rude to this individual that's running behind him. He doesn't know it's Umar. He's not being rude to him, but he wants to get the message to the Khalifa first. So he's responding to him. He's saying, the Muslims won and this and that. So Umar is keep sending these questions to him, and he's saying, oh, the Muslims had victory. The battle is over. This and that, right? So as both of them are rushing in, Umar is behind him. The people of the city start greeting Umar and saying, what happened? What's the news? So he turns around and realizes that Umar has been with him, right? That was Umar radiallahu anh that was following him. So he says, he starts apologizing, and Umar radiallahu anh says, don't worry about this. Tell us about, and this is actually a famous incident that takes place. So he says, tell us about the Muslims. What's going on? How did the army go? And Umar radiallahu anh was extremely concerned with the condition of the Muslims. Now, the reason why I bring this story is to compare it to the incident that just took place when the Muslims walked into the court of the Persians, right? The level of, or the way, the style of rulership, the style of your position, and thinking that, everybody has to address you in a certain way and this and that, was completely different when it came to Umar. He had no problem in he didn't for a moment tell this rider that, hey, I'm Umar, stop, descend, tell me what happened, right? Rather, he chased him, and he was so concerned with the affairs of the army and the affairs of the Muslims and what the condition of the Muslims were, that he did not care if he was the one running behind this messenger. All right, so this battle caused pretty much the gates of Iraq, right? It was an open end from Iraq, Persia, Iran at that time. It was pretty much an open go. And as we'll discuss, we're going to jump back to the Sham side of things of Khalid ibn Walid. But when we get back to this, you'll see how then they progress, eventually remove this last Sassanid king, this last Persian king from the throne as well. So and we're ending with this inshallah. On the other side, we were talking about Khalid ibn Walid and the city of Damascus, and we mentioned how how Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh eventually takes Damascus after the passing away of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. we're going to discuss this a little bit now before we go back to the other side. I will end with this one story as we're coming towards the end of our time, that the Roman emperor at the time, he realized that the Muslims were gaining certain cities, so he gathers a large army, and this is what we're going to start discussing. He gathers a large force, and he starts sending him towards the Muslims. Now, the Muslims realize that they pretty wide. So they need to retreat to certain cities to hold their ground in certain cities. However, if you remember, as the Muslims took certain cities, right, during this time and even way after this, the Muslims were the minority. Right? A lot of times when we think of Islamic history during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman or Ali, or even after that, Muawiyah radiallahu an, and continuing into the Umayyads, the Muslims were a minority in all of these lands, right, for the most part, until way later. So during the time of Umar, the Muslims were a minority. However, the cities that they ruled during this time, they realized that, especially in this engagement with the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, that they need to retreat. And because the people weren't Muslims, they were paying jizya, and jizya is paid for protection. That the military, the Muslim military, will protect these lands, will protect everything. So the people living in those lands would pay a certain jizya, and they don't need to engage in any military activities. They can't be drafted into the army or be part of the war. So the Muslims, as they started retreating, because now they're in battle with this the Roman emperor, they need to retreat and hold their ground. As they retreat from the cities, they actually return the jizya. So they returned the jizya to the people they took it from, because they had to retreat, and they cannot fulfill the word that they gave him or that they charged the jizya for. So instead of actually retreating and taking the money and the wealth and the jizya with them, they returned it to the residents of the land, informing them that because we can't fulfill that promise, right, we're not allowed to take this money that we took. So this jizya was paid for a reason, and because that reason is not being fulfilled, we have to return that jizya. And again, this highlights the honor, right, the ethics, the standard that the Muslims held themselves to at this early time, at this period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. So we'll end with this, inshallah, and we'll open it up for any Q&A. I hope it wasn't a lot with the names. I try to use a couple of names so we know what's going on between the two armies. But go ahead, the chat box is open for